You're listening to Edge of Faith, a multimedia magazine where we discuss art and culture through a Christian lens. So, Kutter, thanks for joining us today. How are you doing?
I am doing pretty well out here in Southern California. It's sunny in the middle of January, so.
Wonderful. I'm in Colorado and it's cold.
Yeah, I would bet.
Exactly. So, why don't we go ahead and get started? We're talking about your book, Breaking the Marriage Idol, Reconstructing Our Cultural and Spiritual Norms. So, as the title implies, and the question I'm about to ask is why did you want to turn the paradigm of marriage on its head? I mean, why rethink the importance of marriage is critical now?
Yeah. Well, first off, so that your listeners and everyone knows, I didn't turn the importance of marriage on its head. Jesus did.
Right.
No, I sort of a joke, but sort of true. The book, I would say, is not. I never set out to, in my life's mind, my future self. I never thought, one day I'm going to write a marriage book. Right. That wasn't something I thought I'd do, but it just happened that I. Both at Fuller, where I teach, interact with all sorts of colleagues, staff, administration, faculty, but also students who range in ages and come from all sorts of different kind of contexts and life situations. That these conversations kept emerging that I couldn't quite name it at first what the commonality was. But you'd get people telling me these stories that all had a kind of common refrain. And then when you add that to my background as a youth pastor and young adults pastor, when I was in pastoral ministry before becoming an academic, and then as my current sort of service in my local church right now, I'm on the board of my church and am involved there as well, quite a lot. In all these different spaces, I had these conversations where people would start talking about this phenomenon they encountered, usually within their religious Christian communities, their worshiping community, that set them at odds with that community, made them feel like they weren't quite doing something right. And it didn't matter if you were single or married, if you were young or old, widowed or divorced. They all shared that common sensibility, and it was that essentially they weren't quite living up to this idealized picture of marriage that they had been handed. And it had all these sort of ripple effects. And they were different kind of effects depending upon who the person was and whether they were married or single or a man or a woman or, what stage of life, et cetera. But all of them sort of shared that same frustration of, I was given this picture of a relationship that was supposed to do certain things. And it really seems like, for any number of reasons, that was basically a lot of hogwash. And the question that kept coming up was, or my response to all these was, well, that's clearly not a quote unquote biblical or Christian picture of marriage. Why would you ever think that? And so the conversation would emerge that, well, they think that because our churches, our ministries, our books, our media, all this really paint a picture and create a vision of marriage that I think is, at the end of the day, not in line with what I would say is the sort of orthodox Christian view of how marriage should function. So that's kind of how it emerged, and why I thought, well, I guess now is as good a time as any to start talking about a way that we as a community have distorted that picture that we've been handed.
Right, absolutely. Before we get any farther, I'd like to say, as I was reading the book, it was really nice the way many of the chapters, most of the chapters, have like a personal story at the beginning from someone and another one at the end. So it actually helps kind of tie in what you're saying. So it's not, just something academic. It's something, as you said, you actually ran into. That's wonderful.
Yeah. And even I'll even say on top of that collection of vignettes and stories were the people that kind of helped me co-author the book, really. I met with that group of people. I mean, it started with they were just sharing stories, and I said, hey, I want you to contribute to this. And then I gathered them together about monthly, every other month, to give them early drafts of the book and to talk about it. And so it really is a reflection of here's I don't feel like this is my book, but it is me sort of stewarding these stories and trying to draw some threads between them, both theologically, culturally, etc.
That's totally awesome. So, back to, as you were saying, the people were kind of struggling with this image that they were given from the church on marriage. Could you kind of maybe unpack that a little bit more? Tell us
Sure.
what is that picture they're getting, and why are they struggling with it?
Well, I think there's a handful of facets to it, but at the end of the day, there's kind of two or three primary elements, and the first one is very basically this notion that marriage is in fact the ultimate sort of relational arrangement, and it's one, and it is the kind of highest calling and the relationship to which all Christians are called. So it's both a picture of something that is assumed, meaning everyone is intended, even designed, to ultimately be married. And the reason we are ultimately designed to be married is because it's only in marriage that you can encounter the kind of relational intimacy and love and reciprocity that God has called us toward, both with another human, but then in many cases with God's very self. And that absent that, if you don't have that relationship, you actually are missing something. You're missing an integral element of what it means to be human. And I think that is tied, and at least I tied in the book, to another notion of basically sexual activity as another element that's necessary for a fully functioning humanity, right? So in a sort of the classical Orthodox Christian notion of marriage between a man and a woman in a monogamous sort of dyad, that is the ultimate picture of what it means both to be human, to be related, and ultimately to be a Christian. And that's the starting point that a number of folks, especially, I first wrote this with sort of North American 20th and 21st century Christians in mind. And I've been surprised to hear how much that carries over to other cultures, other nations, other continents, in fact. But that was what I had in mind. And with that picture comes a number of sort of inverse. That's maybe the positive way of saying it. The negative would be saying, if you don't sense that you are called to marriage, then there's something wrong or broken about you. If you have entered marriage and you have something, let's say, some flaw, maybe you're not as giving as you should be, or even worse, you have some sort of sexual dysfunction. You're rampantly promiscuous or something. If you go into a marriage and marriage doesn't fix that in you, it doesn't solve that problem, then your marriage is suspect. So it works in both ways, where when you idealize this picture of marriage, it both becomes the archetype that everyone is encouraged and sometimes coerced into adopting, and then it also starts functioning in a way that it's asked to answer a number of problems that I don't think the marriage relationship was ever asked to address. And so you go into marriages expecting it to answer certain things that it can't. And if you can't go into marriage, or you choose not to go into marriage, you are inherently seen as a sort of second-class citizen, or broken or flawed in some way, shape, or form.
So I guess I need to make clear first is you're telling me that marriage does not answer all questions and fix everything immediately?
That is correct. That is correct.
I've been married 25 years and I've been trying to figure that one out. So I guess that leads into my next question, and it's in some ways, I guess, I don't know if sad's the right word. If you're married, you probably in the church you don't notice this, but in the book you bring up, about the segregation between married and single people in the church, and you just touched on that. Maybe you could enlighten us a little more on that
Yeah.
aspect? Why are things
Sure.
segregated? Because there's in the history you have monastics and different things that they
Yeah.
chose such things.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I so there's the big global answer, and that's probably too long for for our conversation. But yeah, I mean, like that's a good example of you have a group of people that would say we want for the sake of our calling, right? God has called me to devote myself to X, Y, or Z. And I, of course, me being Kutter, I'm not going to question anybody's calling in that sense of if you feel like that's genuinely what God wants you to sincerely devote your life to, go for it. My task as your brother or sister in Christ is to help create an environment where you can thrive in that calling. Part of it's to help discern that. And so I would, I'm not a part of a monastic community. And I would say if someone was a part of my community and they go, I think I want to go out into the desert and live by myself, I would ask them a number of questions about why, et cetera, and help them discern that calling. And then if we come to the point where that's what they want to do, help, give them the tools and support them in the best way we can. Okay. That being said, that's one route to take. Another route is now the group of folks who, in this case, are all married, say, okay, we've decided that we're going to all get together, let's say once a week on a Sunday morning, and for an hour and a half, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. We're going to sing together. We're going to read scripture. We're going to take communion. We're going to have our kids be taught. We're going to bring them in occasionally. We want to be distracted, et cetera, et cetera. And if you're single, we'd actually like you to meet over here in this other room because we think you have special needs that need to be addressed. Now, that may even be incredibly sincere and well-meaning, right? I mean, and it could be that we even had some single folks in our community that said they'd like something like that. But I think those are two different kinds of ways of thinking about the life of our communities. And that is, are we all getting together and trying to discern how do we best support the various callings that God has placed on our lives? That's one way to go about it. The other way is we're going to set up a structure that privileges a subset of the community, and by the very way that we've structured it, eliminates from view or asks a whole group of people to basically do something different. And that's how I see a lot of our sort of niche ministries. Now, again, the size of the church matters with all of this, but there is a challenge, I think, that is presented to our ecclesiology and our worshiping life if we think we need single people to be in their own space, to work out their own issues, as if they can do that in separation from or without a relationship with the larger body of the church. That being said, I also would want to say sometimes it's great if single people would like to get together and just be with single people and not be bothered. I mean, for me, I've got young kids. Just not be bothered by kids. I mean, that's that's a thing, and that's legitimate. And I mean, my goodness, I would want to do that in any context. There's a place where maybe people that are married, remarried, divorced. I mean, I think all of these are interesting ways of aligning ourselves, as long as we're not privileging just one subset of those at the expense of everybody else.
right, absolutely. So I guess another piece that I was really thinking about that you point out in the book is how, and that marriage doesn't fix everything, and people seem to be looking at marriage from the doctrine that they've been taught that
Yeah.
is what makes them become a Christian. And as you were discussing all this about married and single segregations, I was raised up in the South, and there's a plethora of churches you could go to, but in my area there was one church, and it was really huge too,
Yeah.
that its focus, and it was well known that if you're single and you want to find somebody, that's the
Mm-hmm.
church to go to. So they had this whole like singles thing going on that
Yep.
was to get
Yeah.
people married. I'm not sure what happened when they got married. I guess they went to a different church, but
They graduated. Yeah.
exactly. That's probably not the way to go about it, right?
Yeah. I mean, again, I'm hesitant to like be overly critical of it's not like we should never have focused ministries, right, or focused offerings within a church for particular sets of people. That makes sense. I mean, maybe there's a bunch of people that just love dance or painting or hunting, or something like that, where you go, hey, it makes sense for us to get together. And larger churches, especially, there's a critical mass where you can do that. Great. It is another thing, is what you're describing, and that is to say, one, part of our objective is to get people married.
Right.
That's an odd thing. And then two, to then create a setup where now that you are married, you have to go to something else. Like you've got to, again, I jokingly say graduate, or now you can be fully accepted into the fold of real worshiping adults. At setting it up like that, just it's inherently baked in to suggest that you are kind of waiting in the wings, you're incomplete, and you aren't really ready to fully contribute as a full-fledged member of the body of Christ until you've done this one thing, and that is get married. And I think that's, pragmatically a weird way to do it, but it's also sort of biblically and theologically flawed, if for no other reason than the fact that the central figure of Christianity, Jesus, never got married. So I wonder, where would Jesus land in our current day ministries of that nature if the goal was to get Jesus married, and or he wouldn't really be able to contribute until he did get married? We wouldn't know what to do with Jesus. So for those reasons, I go, we need to rethink our aims, our objectives, and then how we really organize ourselves in light of that ultimate aim, especially if we remove, again, I'm not even saying marriage is bad, and a lot of people have great marriages, fantastic, but we do need to remove it from the place that it's been put in recent history, that would make us organize entire ministries according to, can we get these single people married so that they can get on with their lives?
Right, absolutely. So in the book you write, and I'll say, quote, "The church is radically uncomfortable directly addressing the human person as a fundamentally sexual being," unquote. How does this create a burden for marriage?
Well, I think in a number of ways. And that line, especially when I say the church, it is a generalized statement that I think holds to especially the Protestant wing of the church of the last, 13 to 1700 years, let's say. So there are and could be exceptions to this rule. However, there is this ambivalence with the sexual aspect of our bodies, and that goes all the way back to Augustine. That there really is and part of it comes out of just his own personal biography, right? The way that he was shaped and formed before he became a Christian, and then afterwards, and the way that he influenced so many others after him. There's a lot of other philosophies and stuff that go in that. But the reason that I come down to making that statement is because at the end of the day, what it results in is a kind of suspicion of our bodies, and specifically a suspicion of our bodies as sexual bodies, such that you get people treating the sexuality as kind of this a necessary evil. Like it's good that we have it, because once you are married and you have to, you have to have sex, then at least there's a good end of that, and that is the creation of children. Okay. Mm-hmm. But it's so risk heavy. Like our sexuality is so prone to being misdirected and co-opted and perverted that we speak of it as if we would rather not have it, right? And so a big part then of how that plays itself out in on the ground sort of Christian teaching, I look at the way that we talk about sex with young adults and youth, right? Adolescents, teenagers, and then young adults. And it's this weird kind of fractured narrative that we hand them. And that is, on the one hand, we're operating with this paradigm that to be a fully functioning sexual creature, is the sort of ultimate expression of human reality and intimacy. And the only place that that's appropriate or condoned is within a monogamous marriage, right? Sanctioned by the state and the church. So you cannot express your sexuality outside of that very narrow domain. And if you do, it's, or outside of that, don't think about it, don't talk about it, suppress it, get rid of it. And yet it's the best thing ever, right? So it's this, especially now if you imagine teaching this idea to 13 to 17-year-old males, that's a really weird thing, right? To tell them, hey guys, this is the most amazing thing in the world, and it will ultimately fulfill you in ways I can't even express. However, don't you dare think about it, consider it, whatever. The hard thing about that is what that doesn't actually get to is, okay, let's actually talk to teenagers and let's say teenage boys, because I once was a teenage boy, so I can identify there. Let's talk to them about what it looks like to actually navigate their life in the contemporary world as a human being who is sexual, and to do that in faithful ways. And for me, that means we have to find ways for them to harness that sexual energy in ways that lead to flourishing, that lead to not just their own flourishing, but the flourishing of the people around them. And to do that in generative and life-giving ways, not simply sort of repressive and punitive ways. And I think, at least the way that I read, again, these are certain communities, let's say the subculture of evangelicalism and North American Christianity at the turn of the 21st century, I mean, that narrow, really operated in terms of a don't ask, don't tell kind of mentality of it's wrong, it's bad, it's terrible, don't do it, don't think about it, and so we're not going to even talk about it. But once you get married, all bets are off and anything goes. And there's a great range in between there of what does it look like to have sexual integrity? What does it look like to navigate a hypersexual world as a Christian and to do it faithfully? How do I do all that as I'm maybe even preparing for having a wife? How might the navigation and the stewarding of my sexuality help prepare me for the kind of fidelity that's required once I do commit to one spouse for the rest of my life? It's no small wonder to me that we have such rampant rates of divorce within Christianity and such rampant rates of infidelity when we basically tell people, we give them no tools to manage their sexuality before they get married. We leave them to themselves. And then when they do get married, it turns out that they still haven't learned how to do that in faithful ways. And we're surprised when men and women fail in having integrity and being faithful to their spouses. That should be exactly what we predict if we don't address it and talk about it as a church with people who are both single and married. And that's what I mean when I say we're really uncomfortable talking about ourselves as sexual creatures at every stage of life, and who are all called at different times and different seasons to our own specific kind of sexual faithfulness, depending upon the relationships that God has placed us in.
Wow. That's a lot to chew on.
Yeah, sorry. I don't know if that's where you're going with it, but
no, it is.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, part of it is back to, me being a youth pastor and going, I wasn't equipped at the time either. And it's now been, my goodness, it's crazy how fast time goes. But, it was 20 years ago that I was supposed to be leading teenagers and helping them. And this was even before, social media and sexting and all the other stuff that, I was, trying to help, for example, young men who were addicted to online pornography. And they had this thing early on that was, I can't remember exactly what it was called, but it was software that you could get, that you could put on your computer. And so a teenager put on his computer software that would send me, his youth pastor, and maybe his a school teacher, and maybe a parent, every website that they went to on their browser. And I would get a report either daily or weekly of everything they saw. And so there was a few of the students in my youth ministry that signed up for that, and I got that. And so then I would meet with them, in either a sort of discipleship capacity or just a kind of general mentoring capacity. And I would ask them, I'm like, so that I'm I now know everything that you you have just been looking at this week. And does that make you uneasy or nervous? And it was interesting. That sort of mechanism didn't work that well, at least for these students. And it was really interesting to me that wasn't a threat. That sort of, oh no, I may be found out, didn't do anything to help give them the tools they needed to know, okay, what am I called to do in this situation? What does it mean for me to be a faithful disciple here, in terms of navigating this sort of cultural context and stewarding my sexuality in faithful ways? And the only recourse, the only tool I had as youth pastor was that kind of punitive, shame-based thing, that you're going to be found out. I'm going to know. Your parents are going to know. And the things that I discovered were, one, it simply didn't work. And two, I didn't have any other recourse as a pastor. I struggled to know, okay, now what kind of life-giving, constructive kind of tools can I give them that will help them lead to sort of maturity and flourishing. And so that's part of where I might get on sort of a soapbox or whatever, is I see all that as a reflection of our inability to really talk about sex in a constructive way.
We're going to have a whole nother interview where we discuss whether that was culturally generated to not have those kind of guilt feelings, or if it's an erosion of personal space due to internet. I mean, that we could go on for a long time on that one. Crazy.
Let's do it. Let's talk.
Absolutely. So I guess though, for this interview, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave the audience on the subject?
I think of all the people that have sort of talked to me about the book or asked me about it, it's interesting because, and it makes sense. I mean, my actual area of expertise is cultural studies. And so the thing that people come back and said, ooh, this, so what's interesting about this is I think the first part of the book, I analyzed Disney princess films, the songs and music of Taylor Swift, and Bachelor and Bachelorette TV show, which, by the way, is the longest running, most successful reality TV show in history. And I just saw has picked up they've made another iteration of it just this week, I saw advertised. So it continues to captivate our imagination. So I think there's a lot of stuff in the book that I found really interesting and helpful. It was fun to write. But people keep coming back, and I underplay and undervalue, apparently, that first part where I just give a sort of critical, descriptive analysis of culture writ large, right? Seen through the lens of these three cultural products. Music, movies, and television. And I think if I was going to say, here's the sort of takeaway I would want people to see, it's how deeply formative those visions of marriage, those visions of intimacy, of romance, of relationship are on all of us. And whether we're Christians or not, they have really profoundly influenced us in ways that we need to grapple with. We need to be aware of how they've shaped us. And those moments where they can be actually helpful for a Christian, and at least as you read my book, many ways where they can undermine what I think is a sort of gospel-oriented notion of marriage. And so I think that's the interesting thing. It's the thing that I think the least about in the book because it's what I do all day, every day. But I think it's the thing that most people, for any number of reasons, don't actually consider is how is my consumption of all these different cultural artifacts shaping what I think marriage is, and even down to the level of how God would like me to view marriage.
Wow. Well, Kutter, thank you so much for once again taking the time to share with us, for writing the book, and for being you.
Sure. Absolutely. It's a great time. Always have fun talking with you.